You're watching Newsday this Friday. I'm Aaron Young with you live from Melbourne. US President Donald Trump lobbed somewhat of a verbal hand grenade at Theresa May, saying the British Prime Minister had wrecked the UK's exit from the EU and killed any chance of a free trade deal with the US post-Brexit. For more on this and to dissect everything that's happened over the past couple of days as Donald Trump tours Europe, we're joined live by Peter Mathews, Professor of Political Science at Cyprus College. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Have you seen anything like this before?
Never. And from the history books, certainly not even in our modern history. It's remarkable and amazing and kind of outrageous because Britain, one of our closest, if not the closest ally of the U.S., has been insulted by President Trump, the Prime Minister. He says that Britain has lost its culture because of immigration. He says that the Prime Minister May made the wrong move about a soft Brexit exit, and he wants to threaten her with not having any kind of trade with the United States as a result, the type of trade that she would want. And this is just not acceptable when it comes to a close ally such as this. And Mr. Trump is just disrupting the entire NATO alliance in many ways after calling Germany captive of Russia yesterday.
It's been a very difficult week for the British Prime Minister, capped off on Sunday first by the resignation of the man in charge of Brexit, essentially David Davis, then the Foreign Secretary who had been pushing for such a long time for Brexit, for that vote to take place. He had in the past said that he would never actually put his hand up to be Prime Minister, that man being Boris Johnson. Now you have the President of the United States really singling him out and saying that he would make a great future Prime Minister.
That's just quite incredible that he would do that. And shame Prime Minister May by saying that he would make a better Prime Minister than May, so to speak. Can you imagine Prime Minister May coming to the United States and saying that, you know what, Barack Obama was a much better president than Mr. Trump. He should be reelected once again, and the Constitution should be changed to allow him to be reelected. That would be completely unacceptable and outrageous. You don't do that to any other country, especially a leading country in the world and an ally, and a person who, Ms. May, actually could be an ally of President Trump's, ideologically to some extent, being both conservatives from the Conservative Party. But still, Trump doesn't want to work anything out with people, and it seems to me even leadership of our allies. It's not right.
What's been leading up to this? I guess you could call it a bit of a diplomatic stoush between the American president and now the British Prime Minister. That newspaper article, the front page of The Sun, hitting stands just as they were sitting down for dinner there at Blenheim Palace, the first day of 4 for this visit. What happens next, do you think? Because obviously the British Prime Minister behind the scenes won't be too happy with the American president, who usually when they're asked about foreign powers and prime ministers and presidents' issues, the answer is we don't get involved in domestic affairs. That's very much different to what we're seeing here.
Right. Very, very different. It puts Ms. May, Prime Minister May, in a very, very difficult spot. She's already didn't have a very popular government at this point because she's trying to negotiate the Brexit exit. And this is putting her in a much worse condition. And who knows if her government might end up having to resign. Hopefully she can work it out from her point of view. But Mr. Trump is not helping in any way. He's breaking any kind of protocol in that regard. And it's a very dangerous situation because he seems to be treating many of our leading allies, such as Germany and France, in the same way, especially France and Britain. I'm not sure what leads him up to do this, except that I think he's gung-ho on dividing the country, United States of America, and also dividing Britain into those who are for a globalized, more humane world, humane globalization, versus those who say, let's retract and retrench and just become only domestic producers and become xenophobic and use that. How could he otherwise say that Britain has lost its culture because of immigration when Britain has become richer and the British people have come to accept immigrants more fully in the last 30 or 40 years? And it's a real tragedy what's happening right now. I think Mr. Trump, unfortunately, is a big part of this, and he needs to really change things. But I don't have too much hope that he will at this point.
Who do you think was the target when he made these comments to the Sun newspaper? Do you think he was trying to target the British Prime Minister, or do you think this is trying to play it safe with his base back home in the United States? Because, as we know, concerns about terrorism and immigration work pretty well when it comes to party politics.
Yes, unfortunately so when it's used in that regard. And I think he's targeting his base back home. His 35% of the people who still support him. Many of them are paranoid about outside influence, about immigration and international community. They're very paranoid about that. It's America first, as he puts it in his own foreign policy slogan, America first, which quite often means everyone else comes second or gets left behind or has to kowtow. And that doesn't work in a modern international arena where there are many different regional powers and major world powers. The U.S. is not the only power in the world, and it may still be somewhat of a superpower, but other countries will start getting together and opposing the U.S. But now there's an interesting wild card. What's going to happen when he meets with Mr. Putin, President Putin, this coming week? What's going to happen there in his meetings? He's also got a private meeting with Putin with only a translator there. We need to know what's going on when that kind of a meeting occurs, and then subsequently the meeting with his advisors. But what will happen? How will he reorder the Russia-U.S. relationship compared to our traditional allies? And I'm not someone who says that the U.S. should be automatically antithetical toward Russia and make Russia an enemy, but we've got to be very cautious about how we let Russia into our circle and what we demand of them before that we would let them in fully. And there are things that have to be worked out because the two countries have not always seen eye to eye, especially since the Soviet Union fell apart, and the détente that President Nixon worked out has a long way before. And we need to get back to that, but do it in the right way, not in a way that upsets the entire world relationships among the major countries, especially our allies.
Obviously, President Trump is trying to do a bit of a reset here. The Marshall Plan post-World War II that saw the United States increase its military spending, essentially to try and keep Europe from going back to war with each other while also rebuilding Europe at the same time. He has obviously come in. He's a businessman now looking at this situation. Things are a lot more transactional. He's now calling for NATO countries to double their spending, perhaps without realising that leaders can't necessarily do that straight away. They have cabinets and parliaments in many cases. In this country, we have a former Prime Minister, Conservative side as well, Tony Abbott, Peter. And in recent days, he gave a speech in the United States where he warned our government here in Australia to be careful. We need to stand on our own 2 feet when it comes to military spending because under this president, he still has 2.5 years to go, possibly 4 on top of that if he is re-elected. You can't be sure that if there were any issues in this region, that the United States would actually come to our rescue. What do you think of that?
It's a very precarious situation. But a few numbers and stats have to be straightened out first. You know, NATO has an operating collective budget, out of which the U.S. only provides 22%. The other NATO members provide the other 78%. If you look at the troop numbers, the U.S. has 1.3 million troops in arms, and yet the other countries in NATO provide over about 2 million troops altogether in their military. So it's not like the NATO members, other than the U.S., are carrying a very light load, overburdening the United States. I think the United States is spending too much. It's spending 3.5% of its GDP. Much of it goes to wasteful defense spending, some of it with weapons that don't work or are not needed, such as the M1 Abrams tank, or even sometimes the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter has had a lot of criticism how it operates and been grounded quite a bit. So we have to look at our defense spending to make sure that it's really balanced and that it's coordinated with our allies and not blame the allies for spending too little. They are sovereign nations who can decide how to spend their money. And NATO is committed with Article 5 to come to each other's rescue if one nation is attacked. There's no collective responsibility of having to have a certain amount of defense budget spent, other than the 2% that was a guideline that was set up, which they are meeting, by the way.
Okay, Peter Mathews, thanks. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it today.